The desert wind carried dust across the barren plains, a soundless witness to the struggles of those who tried to carve a living out of the hard land. The sun was sinking, spreading streaks of red and gold across the endless horizon. On a lonely stretch of prairie, a ranch house sat weathered and worn, the boards faded by years of sun and storm. Its corral was half broken, and the fences leaned like tired men. Cows grazed in the distance, their shapes barely moving against the backdrop of tall grass. Life here was rough, and every soul who stayed knew it was a gamble to last another season. Inside the house, the air smelled of coffee grounds and wood smoke. The rancher sat at the rough-hewn table, his hands scarred from years of rope burns, branding irons, and too many close calls with wild stock. He was a man who spoke little, not out of rudeness but because silence had become easier than words. His life had been measured in small victories, a calf saved during a blizzard, a harvest of hay that managed to last through winter, and a roof that didn't leak during the spring rains. Yet he carried the weight of years heavier than the saddle on his back. That evening, as dusk deepened into night, he heard a sound he wasn't expecting. Not the coyotes that yipped across the fields, not the rustle of a restless horse. It was different, low, and carried with it a human edge. He stepped outside, the boards of the porch creaking under his boots. The wind tugged at his hat brim as he narrowed his eyes into the shadows. Something was moving along the fence line, staggering, slow. His heart gave a dull thud. Out here, miles from the nearest town, you didn't get visitors unless they had a reason. The figure came closer, shoulders bent, one arm held against the side. When the rancher finally saw the man's face, his breath caught. This wasn't a stranger. He had seen this man before, years ago, back when the territory was more wild than settled, when cattle drives stretched for weeks and men didn't always return from them. The man's face was pale, streaked with dirt and blood, his clothes torn and stiff with dust, his boots dragged across the ground as if every step cost him dearly. The rancher felt the old instinct to reach for his rifle, but his hand froze. The injured man stopped just short of the porch, his voice dry and cracked as he whispered, "Please, just make it quick." Those words struck harder than any bullet. They weren't the words of a man begging for help, but of one asking for an end. The rancher's chest tightened. He hadn't expected to hear that plea, not out here, not from a face out of the past. The two men stared at one another, silence hanging between them heavier than the desert heat. The rancher's hand hovered near the doorframe where the rifle rested inside, but he didn't move to take it. His body stiffened, caught between mercy and horror. The night deepened around them, the prairie quiet except for the low groan of the wounded man. The rancher saw the glint of something tied at the man's belt, a pouch worn thin by travel. He didn't know what was inside, but instinct told him this wasn't just some drifter who had wandered too far from the trail. This man had carried something with him, something worth dying over. And now he stood on the porch asking for an end, not salvation. The rancher's mind spun back to long-forgotten days. He remembered trails lined with dust, the smell of sweat and leather, the sound of hooves pounding against the earth. He remembered deals made in the dim light of saloons, when fortunes could be won or lost with a single hand of cards. He remembered this man, though the memory was blurred by time. They had crossed paths once, tied together by something unfinished. Now fate had dragged that unfinished business to his doorstep. The words hung in the air, unshaken. "Please, just make it quick." The rancher froze, his jaw tight. He thought of the weight of pulling that trigger, the sound that would follow and the silence after. He thought of what kind of man it would make him, and what it might reveal about the stranger's past. Something inside him fought against the request, while another part understood too well what it meant to be worn down by the world, to reach the end of one's strength. The man on the porch sagged against the railing, his eyes half shut, his breath shallow. "You don't understand," he whispered, forcing out each word. "They're coming. And if they find me here, they'll come for you too." His head lifted, his gaze sharp with sudden fear. "You don't have much time." The rancher felt his stomach twist. The night suddenly seemed heavier, the silence too deep, as if the land itself was holding its breath. He searched the dark plains beyond the house, half expecting to see shadows moving where none should be. Whoever they were, the stranger believed in their approach with the certainty of a man who had seen too much. Something stirred in the distance, faint but real, a sound carried by the wind, the steady thud of hooves far off but drawing closer. The rancher gripped the porch railing, every instinct alive with warning. Out here, a rider after dark wasn't always a friend, and more than one rider meant trouble, plain and simple. The man on the porch tightened his hold on his side, blood seeping through his fingers. His voice cracked as he forced the words out once more. "I can't fight them anymore, but you'll have to choose. Quick, before it's too late." The rancher's breath felt stuck in his chest. He could turn the man away, refuse to be part of whatever past had followed him. He could grant his wish and end his suffering, or he could drag him inside, bar the door, and wait for the storm that was surely coming. None of those choices sat easy on his shoulders. The hoofbeats grew clearer, steady as a heartbeat against the earth. Whoever was coming was near, and they weren't coming quietly. The rancher looked at the man once more, his hand hovering over the door where the rifle waited inside. The plea echoed in his head, mingled with the thunder of approaching riders. "Please, just make it quick." The rancher's jaw locked, his whole body tense. He had seconds to decide, maybe less. The wind whipped across the porch, carrying the dust of the open plains. Behind him, the door creaked softly in the breeze as though urging him inside. In front of him, the stranger's eyes begged for mercy, and out beyond the darkness, the sound of riders closing in grew louder, nearer, unstoppable. The rancher froze. Then he did the unthinkable. The rancher's hand trembled as he reached for the rifle, though he wasn't sure if he planned to lift it against the man on his porch or against the riders closing in. His heart thumped in his chest, not from fear alone, but from the weight of what lay ahead. The man's words kept circling through his mind. Whoever was coming, it wasn't the kind you welcomed with open arms. He had lived long enough on this land to know trouble when it was near, and the sound of those hooves carried a message of danger. The injured man's breathing was shallow, his eyes half-glazed yet still sharp enough to study the rancher with a desperate kind of trust. He leaned heavier against the railing, leaving a dark stain on the wood. The rancher wanted to ask questions, wanted to demand answers about why this man had stumbled to his door and why he had brought danger with him, but time wasn't offering that luxury. In a low voice almost swallowed by the wind, the rancher finally spoke. "Who are they?" The stranger shook his head weakly. "Men who don't forgive, men who won't stop. They want what I carry. They'll kill for it just like they already tried." His hand brushed the pouch tied to his belt, the leather worn smooth as if it had been touched too often. The rancher glanced at the pouch, wondering what could be inside. Money, land deeds, gold. Out here, fortunes shifted on the smallest scraps of paper or rumor. But the fear in the man's eyes told him it was more than greed driving those riders. It was something larger, something worth hunting a man to the ends of the prairie for. The sound of hooves drew closer, steady and sure. The rancher knew he had a choice to make, but every option cut deep. He could send the man away and wash his hands of the whole matter. Yet he had lived long enough to know that some storms didn't leave you be just because you turned your back on them. He could give the man what he wanted and make it quick, but the weight of taking a life would never leave his conscience. Or he could take him inside, stand his ground, and risk his home being swallowed by a fight that wasn't his to begin with. The rancher remembered other nights long ago when he had faced choices like this, though never so sharp. He remembered the war years, when neighbors took sides and suspicion ran like wildfire through every settlement. He remembered the cattle drives when men worked together during the day, but sometimes turned their guns on one another before dawn. And he remembered the face of this same man, though the details blurred. They had crossed paths once when both were younger, when the land was still raw and unforgiving. The memory scratched at him, half-formed but insistent, as though some unfinished thread had been tied between them. The rancher's dog barked from somewhere in the shadows, its hackles raised, the sound tense and alert. That was enough to pull him from his thoughts. The riders were close now. Too close. He opened the door, gripping the rifle in one hand, and motioned for the stranger to come inside. "If you're bringing this fight here, we might as well face it standing." The injured man's knees buckled as he tried to move, but the rancher caught his arm, pulling him through the doorway. The smell of blood mixed with the scent of wood smoke inside the small home. The rancher shoved a chair toward him, and the man collapsed into it, still clutching the pouch at his side. The hoofbeats slowed, drawing near the fence line. The rancher's pulse quickened as he peered out through the slats of the shutters. Moonlight stretched across the plains, and in the distance he saw shadows forming into riders. Not one, but several, 4 at least, maybe 5. They moved with the certainty of men who knew exactly where they were headed. The stranger lifted his head, his voice faint. "You don't understand. They'll come hard, and they won't care who gets caught in the fire." The rancher studied him. "Then you'd better start explaining what's in that pouch before they reach my door." The man hesitated, his fingers tightening protectively around the leather bag. "It's not what you think. It isn't gold and it isn't money. It's proof. Proof that could ruin men who sit higher than you can imagine. That's why they won't let me live. The rancher narrowed his eyes. Proof of what? Corruption. Theft? Murder? Out here, power often rested in the hands of men who claimed law and land as their own. He had seen enough sheriffs bought by silver, enough judges swayed by a handshake in the shadows, but he didn't press for details. He only knew that whatever was inside that pouch had dragged the stranger to his door, and now a band of riders was coming to collect it. The hoofbeats stopped. Silence fell heavy on the land, broken only by the restless shuffle of horses outside. Then came a voice deep and sure. "Evening, rancher. We know he's in there. Send him out and we'll be on our way." The rancher's chest tightened. The voice was calm, almost polite, but it carried the steel of men who didn't ask twice. He stepped back from the window, gripping the rifle tighter. The stranger's eyes locked on him, pleading. "They won't leave you in peace," he whispered. "Once they know I came here, they'll see you as part of it." The rancher drew in a slow breath, his mind torn between the safety of his own land and the truth he couldn't shake. A man asking for mercy on your doorstep wasn't a thing you turned away lightly, but standing against armed riders was something else entirely. He thought of his cattle in the fields, the quiet life he had fought to hold on to after years of hardship, and the home that had taken every ounce of his strength to keep standing. All of it could be lost in a single night if this went wrong. He looked at the stranger again, saw the fire still flickering faintly in his tired eyes. This wasn't a man who had run for nothing. Whatever truth he carried in that pouch, it had driven him to the edge of his life. Outside, the voice called again, this time harder. "Last chance, rancher. Don't make us come take him." The rancher stood in the dim light of the room, the crackle of the fire filling the silence. His dog growled low near the door, sensing the storm waiting outside. The man in the chair gripped the pouch tighter, sweat running down his dirt-streaked face. The night stretched long and heavy, every breath sharp with tension. The rancher's pulse beat in his ears as he stepped toward the door, his decision weighing heavier with each step. Behind him, the stranger rasped out, "If you give me up, they'll kill me. But if you don't, you'll find out just how far they'll go." The wind pushed against the walls of the house, carrying with it the creak of leather saddles and the snort of horses waiting in the dark. The rancher set his jaw, his hand resting on the rifle, his body caught between fear and duty. He didn't know yet what choice he would make, but he knew the night wasn't done with him. Whatever came next, it would mark him forever. The rancher's breath came slow and heavy as he stood by the door, his hand firm on the rifle. The men outside waited like wolves in the dark, patient and sure of their power. Their leader had spoken with a tone that left no doubt they were willing to burn everything down if they didn't get what they wanted. The rancher had heard voices like that before. They were men who didn't fear blood, men who had ridden through towns leaving ruin behind, smiling as though it were no different than rounding up cattle. Inside the small house, the stranger shifted weakly in the chair, his eyes clouded but still sharp enough to know the danger closing in. His hand clung to the pouch like a lifeline, the leather stained dark where his blood had touched it. The firelight flickered across his gaunt face, throwing deep shadows into the lines of weariness carved into it. "They won't leave. Not until they have it," the man said, his voice rough. "You could hand me over and maybe they'll spare you, but maybe they won't. They don't trust anyone. If they think you've seen too much, they'll silence you all the same." The rancher didn't answer right away. His jaw worked as he stared at the floor, torn between the burden of survival and the weight of his conscience. His life had always been one of quiet persistence. He had survived drought, storms, sickness, and loss. But he had never been tested like this, with death riding on his doorstep and truth sitting broken in his chair. The dog growled again, pacing near the door. The sound of leather creaked outside, followed by a low murmur of voices. The men were growing impatient. The rancher's fingers tightened on the rifle. "Tell me what's in that pouch," he said finally, his voice low but steady. The stranger coughed, his breath rattling. "It's papers. Records of land stolen, cattle taken, deals cut in the dark. Names, dates, signatures. Enough to tear down the men who call themselves the law out here. They've built their power on lies and blood, and this proves it." The rancher felt a chill crawl across his skin. He had suspected corruption for years, had seen neighbors pushed off their land and small ranches swallowed whole by bigger outfits backed by powerful men. But proof was something else entirely. Proof meant truth could no longer be hidden behind whispers. Proof was dangerous. The stranger leaned forward, his eyes blazing even through his weakness. "If they get it back, nothing changes. They'll ride free, and men like you will keep breaking your backs while they grow richer. But if this survives, If it reaches the right hands, it could turn everything. The words struck the rancher deep. He thought of his land, how hard he had worked to hold on to it when others around him had lost everything. He thought of friends who had disappeared after refusing to sell, of families who had left the territory with nothing but what they could carry, and he thought of the men outside, waiting to snuff out anyone who stood against them. The leader's voice rang out again, sharper this time. "We're not asking any more, rancher. Send him out now." The rancher turned from the door, looking at the stranger. "You're asking me to risk everything I've built. My home, my life." The man's jaw tightened. "I'm asking you to decide what kind of man you are. The kind who looks the other way, or the kind who stands when it matters." The fire popped in the silence that followed, the sound almost too loud in the heavy air. The rancher moved to the window, lifting the edge of the curtain just enough to look. He saw 4 riders, their shapes dark against the pale glow of the moon. They sat tall in their saddles, rifles resting across their laps, eyes fixed on the house. Their horses shifted, restless, as though sensing the tension of the men who rode them. He studied them one by one. The leader wore a wide hat pulled low, his posture straight and easy, like a man who believed no one could challenge him. Beside him, a younger rider shifted in his saddle, twitchy and quick, his hands too eager for violence. Another sat heavy, broad-shouldered, with the calm of someone used to breaking men with his bare hands. The last lingered at the edge, quiet, his eyes scanning the prairie. A scout, careful and patient. They weren't amateurs. They had come ready. The rancher stepped back from the window, his throat dry. He had faced cattle stampedes, had stood down wild bulls, had even once been caught in a skirmish along the trail. But this was different. This was calculated. They were here to kill, and they would not hesitate. The stranger's voice broke the silence again. "I never meant to bring this to your door, but if you give me up, it won't end here. They'll take me, yes, but they'll come back for you too. Maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but one day. That's how they work. They erase every loose end." The rancher's gut twisted. He wanted to deny it, to believe he could trade the man for peace. But deep down, he knew the stranger was right. Men like those outside didn't leave threats alive, and if they believed he had seen what was in the pouch, he was already marked. The dog barked sharply, ears pricked toward the east. The rancher froze, listening. Another sound carried faint on the wind, not from the group at his fence line, but from farther off. More horses, a second group, moving fast. The stranger's face paled even more. "More of them," he whispered. "They'll surround us." The rancher's stomach sank. Whoever was behind this wasn't taking chances. They had sent more men to make sure the job was done. He felt the walls of his home closing in, his options thinning by the second. His mind raced. He could slip out the back with the stranger, try to cut across the prairie before the riders closed in. But the man was weak, barely able to stand. They'd never make it far. He could stay and fight, but the odds were stacked against him. Or he could take a risk he had avoided his whole life, trusting someone else with his fate. The stranger leaned back, his hand trembling as it pressed harder against his wound. "You don't know what's coming, rancher. These men answer to someone higher, someone who wants the whole territory under his boot. If they take me, the last chance of stopping him is gone." The words echoed through the rancher's mind, stirring memories he had buried. He remembered neighbors speaking in hushed tones about cattle lost to raids no one investigated. He remembered town meetings where ranchers demanded justice, only to be silenced by men with badges who looked the other way. He remembered faces of children left hungry when families were run off their land. It had always been background noise, the kind of injustice he told himself he couldn't change. But now it was at his door, demanding a choice he could no longer avoid. The leader's voice cut across the night again, louder now, with the edge of a threat sharpened to a point. "You've got until the count of 3. The rancher's heart pounded. 1. He glanced at the stranger, at the pouch that seemed to burn in the dim light. 2. The dog bristled, barking furiously, as if trying to push him into action. 3. The rancher gripped the rifle tight, his body rigid, the firelight flickering across his face. He didn't move to the door, not yet. He stood caught between the weight of survival and the pull of something greater than himself. Outside, the men shifted in their saddles, readying themselves. The sound of distant hooves grew louder, promising even more riders joining the circle. The rancher knew one thing for certain. The night was only just beginning, and whatever choice he made would carry a cost that could never be undone. The rancher stood frozen in the dim light of his small home, the rifle heavy in his grip. The stranger's labored breathing filling the silence between the crackle of the fire and the barking of the dog. Outside, the night seemed alive with danger. The first group of riders waited at the fence line, their horses restless, their voices cold and sure. And now beyond them another sound pressed closer. More hooves, thudding against the earth with growing force. The air itself felt tight, as if the prairie held its breath before the storm broke. The stranger leaned forward in the chair, his face slick with sweat, his eyes lit with urgency, despite his fading strength. His hand never left the pouch at his side. "They won't stop, rancher. No matter how long you hold that rifle, they'll find a way to get in. They'll burn your house, tear down your fences, kill your stock. You're not facing cattle thieves tonight. You're staring down men who want to own the land itself." The words twisted inside the rancher's mind. He had built his life with his bare hands, every post of his fence driven deep by sweat, every calf raised through long winters, every plank of his home hammered with care. He had never asked for war, never invited trouble, but here it was on his porch, and now he was tied to it whether he wanted to be or not. The leader's voice outside cut through the night, harsh and commanding. "That was your chance, rancher. Now we're coming to take what's ours." The horses shifted, the sound of hooves scraping dirt as men dismounted. Boots hit the ground. The dog snarled and pressed its body against the door as if ready to throw itself into the fight. The rancher's pulse raced. He knew once they crossed that yard there was no going back. He thought of trying to reason, of stepping out with empty hands and speaking plain. But he had seen too much of men like these to believe in talk. They carried their answers on the ends of their rifles. He had seconds to prepare, maybe less. The stranger's voice rasped from the chair. "If you mean to fight, you can't do it alone. There's a lantern by the barn. Light it, swing it wide. It'll send a signal. There are folks in these parts who still watch, who still listen. If they see the fire, maybe they'll come." The rancher's jaw tightened. He didn't trust neighbors to risk themselves. Most had learned to keep their heads down. Still, the idea burned in his mind. Help might be the only chance they had. Another sound cut through the night. A call from the distance, not from the men at the fence, but from the second group approaching. It was a whistle, sharp and quick, answered almost immediately by the riders already waiting. They were communicating, closing the trap. The rancher's stomach sank. There would be no slipping away through the back fields. The noose was tightening around them. The stranger pushed himself upright with a groan, gripping the table to steady his shaking legs. His face was pale, his body trembling, but his voice carried weight. "They don't just want me. They want you quiet. If they think you'll stand with me, they'll take you too. That's the way this works. Once you're marked, there's no turning back." The rancher looked at him hard. "Then tell me one thing before this breaks. Why you? Why's it you carrying all this?" The man's eyes flickered with something, pain, regret, and a kind of fire that came from long battles fought alone. "Because I was one of them once. I kept their books, wrote their contracts, signed their lies. I know where every deal was cut, where every body was buried under paper and ink. I ran when I realized the blood wasn't just on their hands. It was on mine too. This pouch is my only chance to put it right." The admission struck the rancher deeper than he expected. This wasn't just some stranger hunted down for chance. This was a man tangled in the roots of the power that had been choking the land for years. And now that man was asking him to stand in the fire with him. Boots crunched against the dirt outside. The rancher peered through the crack of the shutter and saw two men advancing, their rifles low but ready. The leader stayed back, his shadow long across the moonlit ground, watching like a hawk circling above. The rancher's breath caught. His finger brushed the trigger of his rifle, his mind racing. He wasn't ready to kill, not yet. But if they crossed that line, he would have no choice. He had defended his land against storms and beasts, but this was different. These were men with intention. The stranger spoke again, his voice quieter now. "If you hand me over, I'll die before morning. But if you don't, you'll have to stand your ground. And once you do, there's no going back to silence." The rancher's hand shook slightly as he tightened his grip. His heart felt split. He thought of the quiet days on the range, the rhythm of cattle moving across the grass, the sound of the wind through the cottonwoods. He thought of the peace he had fought so long to keep, but he also thought of neighbors who had lost everything, of faces that had disappeared without a trace, of wrongs buried in the dust. The dog barked sharply, breaking his thoughts. Outside, the men had drawn closer, their boots crunching louder, their voices murmuring. The second group of riders was nearer now too, their hooves pounding steady, a drumbeat of doom rolling across the plains. The rancher moved to the door, his chest tight with the weight of what was coming. His eyes flicked once more to the stranger, who stood hunched but unbroken, his hand still clutching that pouch as if it were worth more than his life. The stranger's words echoed in his head, heavy and unshakable. "They'll take everything if no one stands." The rancher took a long breath. His finger rested against the trigger. The lantern at the barn loomed in his mind, the last chance to call for help, if help would even come. Outside, the leader's voice rang out one final time, sharper than a blade. "This is your last warning, rancher. Step aside or we'll tear your house down around you." The men advanced closer, their rifles catching the faint light of the moon. Behind them, the distant riders grew louder, their shadows stretching across the land. The dog barked and lunged against the door, desperate to strike. The rancher stood rooted in place, the firelight flickering across his face. His body braced for what came next. The weight of the night pressed down, every second stretched thin with tension. He could feel it in his bones, in the charged air around him. The moment was about to break, the stillness before the storm shattering. The men outside were seconds away from reaching his door. The second wave of riders thundered closer, the sound rolling like thunder across the prairie. The rancher gritted his teeth, every muscle in his body coiled tight. His choice was upon him. The silence before the clash was unbearable, his heart pounding like a drum inside his chest. And then, with the dog growling low and the stranger's eyes fixed on him, the night reached its sharpest edge. The rancher raised his rifle, every breath drawn tight, knowing the next heartbeat would decide everything. The rancher's rifle cracked the silence, a single shot tearing through the night. The first rider fell hard into the dirt, his weapon clattering beside him. The horses reared, snorting, the others shouting as the quiet of the prairie shattered. The dog barked and lunged at the door. The stranger staggered upright with what little strength he had, and the rancher braced himself for what was sure to come next. The men outside opened fire, bullets striking the wooden boards of the house, splinters flying across the room. The rancher ducked, heart pounding, every instinct screaming at him to survive. He returned fire through the window, his aim steady despite the fear surging inside him. One rider cursed loudly, another shouted orders, but the gunfire didn't stop. The stranger clutched the pouch at his side, staggering to the corner of the room to keep out of the line of fire. His voice was hoarse but strong. "They won't let up. They're here to finish this." The rancher gritted his teeth, reloading fast, his hands moving with the experience of a man who had hunted, fought, and endured too many battles with the land itself. He fired again, this time striking a horse. The animal screamed, throwing its rider to the ground. The chaos outside grew, the shouts louder, the hooves pounding against the earth. But then the second wave of riders arrived, their silhouettes breaking against the moonlight. The sound of more guns filled the air, but not all of them were aimed at the house. The newcomers fired into the first group, shouting words the rancher couldn't make out through the gunfire. Confusion broke among the men already at the fence line, their ranks shaken. The rancher squinted through the window, trying to make sense of what was happening. These weren't rescuers, not by any chance. They were part of the same web, men sent to make sure nothing survived the night. Yet greed and mistrust ran deep among men who killed for profit, and the chaos worked to his advantage. The stranger slumped against the wall, coughing. His voice cut through the storm. "This is your chance. Light the barn." The rancher hesitated, torn, but he knew he couldn't hold the house alone forever. He grabbed the lantern hanging by the door, his hands trembling, his chest tight with fear. Kicking the door open, he swung it wide, the flame flickering against the wind. For a moment it seemed small against the vast night, but then it caught, spilling light into the darkness. He hurled it toward the barn, and the dry wood took instantly. Flames leapt upward, fierce and wild, the smoke rising like a beacon. The riders shouted, some startled, some cursing, their eyes drawn to the blaze. The fire roared higher, casting long shadows across the land. The rancher ducked back inside, grabbing the rifle again. The fight outside grew wilder, men firing at one another, shouting over the roar of the fire. Whether out of panic or rage, their unity crumbled. Some rode hard to escape the spreading flames, while others tried to press the attack. Inside, the stranger sank to the floor, his strength leaving him. His eyes flicked to the rancher, tired but determined. "You didn't have to stand with me, but you did. Remember that." The rancher knelt beside him, steadying him as the sounds of the battle raged. "Don't waste breath. You'll make it through." But the stranger shook his head. "No, my time's near done. What matters now is this." He pressed the pouch into the rancher's hands, his grip surprisingly strong for a man so weak. "You take this and you keep it safe. Get it to the right hands. Don't let all this be for nothing." The weight of the pouch settled into the rancher's palm, heavier than any burden he had ever carried. Papers, ink, names. They didn't seem like much compared to bullets and blood. Yet the stranger's eyes burned with conviction, and the rancher understood. This was more than a man's last wish. This was the truth that could shift the fate of the land. The rancher tucked the pouch inside his vest, rising once more as bullets shattered another window. He fired back, steady and deliberate, his resolve hardening. The flames outside had grown taller, casting light across the prairie. Far in the distance, he thought he heard other riders, not enemies, but neighbors answering the signal. It was faint, uncertain, but enough to kindle hope. The gunfire dragged on, the night stretching into chaos. Horses screamed, men cursed, the dog lunged at shadows. The rancher fought with everything he had, each shot a prayer, each breath a battle. The smell of smoke thickened, choking, the fire consuming more than just the barn. When the dust finally settled, the rancher stood in the doorway of his battered home, his rifle empty, his breath ragged. The ground outside was littered with bodies, some still, some groaning in pain. The riders who survived had fled into the dark, their shadows swallowed by the night. The barn was gone, flames reduced to smoldering ash, but the house still stood, scarred yet unbroken. Behind him the stranger lay still, his eyes closed, his chest no longer rising. The weight of silence filled the room, heavy with the cost of the night. The rancher bowed his head, the pouch still pressed against his chest. In the days that followed, word spread. Some said the fire had been a signal. Others whispered that the rancher had fought off a dozen men alone. Neighbors who had long kept quiet found their courage again, stirred by the sight of smoke rising against the sky. Questions began to rise about the men who had disappeared that night, about the truth behind their mission. And in time, the pouch found its way into the right hands, its secrets laid bare. For the rancher, life never returned to the quiet it once was. The scars of that night stayed with him, the broken boards of his house, the empty barn, the memory of the man who had asked for mercy on his porch. But he carried no regret. He knew the land had shifted, that something larger had begun in the ashes. Sometimes, when the wind swept across the prairie at dusk, he would stand on the porch, his dog at his side, and remember the stranger's last words. He thought about how a single choice could change everything, how silence could break a man just as surely as a bullet. And he knew the fight that had come to his door was not just his, but one shared by every soul who called the hard land home. The prairie stretched endless before him, quiet once more, the horizon painted gold by the setting sun. He tightened his hand against the railing, the wood worn smooth by years of work. Life would go on, though different than before. And in that silence he found a kind of peace. The night he had stood frozen, caught between fear and mercy, he had chosen. And though the cost was high, he carried it with the weight of a man who knew he had done the only thing he could. The story of that fire and that fight would live on in whispers, carried by the wind across the plains. But for the rancher, it was enough to stand each morning, watch the cattle move through the grass and know he had faced the darkness and held firm. And when he thought of the stranger, of the pouch, of the words spoken in a voice worn thin with pain, he knew one truth that would never leave him. Some battles aren't chosen. They come to your door, whether you want them or not. And when they do, the only choice left is whether to stand or to fall. That night, he had stood, and the land would never be the same again.